everybody. Welcome to the Fire It Up with CJ show. Today we have Antonio Sacre, and he is here talking about storytelling. He is an award winning performer, storyteller, and also an author in residence in the UCLA Lab school. He's also he just released something on called The World's Second Best Dad. Where can we find it?
On iTunes
On
or from my
iTunes.
website. Yeah, it's a storytelling album of from the oral tradition of stories about being a dad to two children and a husband.
Wonderful. Okay, and my name is Cool, which is
Yeah,
can you hold up the book? Which is
sure.
and this is targeted towards a different age group, right?
Yeah, this is more like middle grade readers and adults. It's made for a read aloud. It's called My Name is Cool, 18 stories from a Cuban Irish American storyteller. And this is sort of it's just a collection of different stories that I've told and researched and performed over the years for kids who are probably 10 years old and up, but also for their families and for their adults to read to them as well. And that was the last book that came out, and one of the stories in that book is going to be published as a picture book next year. So that's been exciting that they're it's funny because I usually write for younger kids, and then this was for older, and then they're taking one of the stories and making it back for younger kids. So that's
Right.
kind of been an interesting journey.
And so tell me, you and your husband, you have how many kids? How old are the kids?
My wife and I, we have two kids. She is a high school English teacher, and we have a 7-year-old daughter who is in second grade and a 10-year-old son who's in fifth grade.
Okay.
And so part of the stories that I've been telling, I tell a lot of different kinds of stories, but in the last 5 years or so, I've been telling a number of stories about their life together and us trying to raise them, and issues and delights and joys that my wife and I have as we're raising these kids. And so that's been a huge part of my life. And storytelling, which was my career before I met my wife even, has now become just a huge part of how we exist as a family.
Mm,
Um, so it goes back and forth, like what happens in my family helps my career. The fact that I have hundreds of stories in my repertoire helps at bedtime with my kids. So it's this really wonderful back and forth that I was not necessarily intentional, but it's become, it's hard to separate work and life. I mean, we're just steeped in story here. My wife is a high school English literature teacher, so she's
oh, wow.
reading for older kids, and so yeah, that's been part of what's been happening for us.
Okay, so you're now in California. You're sheltered in place. You're with your 7-year-old and your 10-year-old kids. And I'm sorry, what's the gender of the kids? You said.
The 10-year-old is a son, and the 7-year-old is a daughter.
Okay,
Yeah.
so you're there with your son and daughter and wife, and you're sheltered in place. How has
Yes.
storytelling entered into your life now?
Well, again, kind of in some ways, there's not that much difference. So we basically we one of the things that's happening is we've been doing for sure a lot more reading. There's
Hmm.
a lot more time.
Hmm.
You know, it's really interesting to see this how busy we are. I mean, we're always busy, right? And in some ways, like we still feel as busy, but there's so many, like the only place we go is once a week to the grocery store, and we also have a lot of groceries delivered anyway, so we're together. And so part of it that's been really interesting is really just trying to tell the story of the day, like what happened today. Well, we're all on top of each other, but to find how, like, my daughter is navigating this because she's a little bit younger and not quite understanding it, and she's writing stories about what the virus is and what does that mean. And my son is making up songs to wash his hands with, right? So this has become a huge part of what we do. But then also with all the extra time just reading, going through old stories, my son and I are going through the Brothers Grimm fairy tales,
Mm.
and we're reading these out loud to each other, and he's requesting certain ones, and I'm reading ones that I wanted to read to him. And then my daughter and I are reading, we're reading a lot of old books that we haven't read in years because she's so
Mm.
old now. But we're revisiting Dr. Seuss books, and like it's just really, it's been very sweet. And then lastly, I have had real great fortune to be able to contact all the old people in my family. My uncles and aunties and great uncles and aunties, and it's very interesting. I've talked to my dad. My dad is in his 80s, and he's healthy and wonderful.
Good.
And he said, "Mijo," he's from Cuba. "Mijo, this reminds me of my great grandmother, who I never heard about."
Mhm.
So I know a lot about my grandmother and his grandmother, but his great grandmother had memories of the Spanish influenza and the typhoid and the dengue. And so, like, what feels completely new and ridiculous and scary to me has happened before. And my
Mm.
dad is able to draw into this generational memory of his great grandmother, my great great grandmother, or whoever it was, and how she said, "Well, this is terrible, but we're going to get through it." And so, this is a story I've never heard before. I have
Mm.
an hour to talk with my dad, and this time allows him to remember these things, which helps me. Like, oh, wait a minute, this is miserable that this happened 100 years ago with the Spanish flu, and we got through it. And so we're going to get through this again. So storytelling reminds us that there, back from Ecclesiastes, there's nothing new under the sun, right? This has all happened before. We have survived, and here are some stories that might get you through it. They might be
Mm.
personal stories. They might be old folk tales. They might be stories from any religious tradition. The flood from the Torah. Like, oh, that was the whole world died in the flood, and then this is how they survived, and this is what they did on the boat, and so this has been
Mm.
really, really. Just got off the phone before with you, talking with one of my old aunties, and she's in her 80s as well, and we had an hour on the phone together, and usually she's running to her volunteer job, and she's going to the library, and she's chasing after her grandchildren, and we had nowhere to go but talk for an hour. And so it was, it's been a really interesting thing. um and I know that others, my brother is a nurse, so he's in the hospital, right? So this is not a time of great reflection. This is a time of some peril for him, and
Mm.
not having masks and trying to figure that out, and still taking care of people who need the care. So that's it's there's an old curse or blessing. May you live in interesting times. These
Mm.
are interesting times. So yeah, yeah.
So the stories that have been helpful to your children, I know you said you were reading Dr. Seuss and the Brothers Grimm. I mean, what stories have you been just like how did you go about picking those books and what kind of messages do they have for kids who are probably really confused and scared?
Yeah, so for my son, it's interesting. Just as a professional storyteller, I tell a mix of personal stories and then also these old folk tales. And my dad, like I said, is from Cuba. My mom is Irish American. One of my friends calls me a leprechaun. So I'm a mix of these. uh, and so I have studied many Cuban myths, Mexican myths, Puerto Rican myths,
Mm.
Central America. That's a very huge part of my life because I perform in Spanish as well. But then I began to realize that I wanted to research other cultures. So I was just personally studying the Grimm fairy tales. And my
Mm.
son, about 2 years ago, when I started studying them, he said, "I want to hear these stories." I'm like, "Oh, no, no, no. Many of these stories, the originally way they're told,
Dark.
every yeah, everybody dies." I said, "This is a story where everybody dies. I don't want to read it to you." So my son, a couple weeks ago, this is actually before all this happened. He's like, "Dad, read me one of those stories where everybody dies." And
Wow.
he's fifth grade, and I think that that's kind of, and I was so in some ways like that's where he is going, right?
Wow.
And sometimes there's like one hero at the end or one heroine at the end, but sometimes in the original Grimm tales, everybody dies, right? So that's one way he's dealing with it. My daughter just wants to laugh and be silly, right? So she's picking these old green eggs and ham, right? She wants to. I do silly voices with Sam I am, and who likes green eggs and ham? And so I feel like part of that is just being silly, finding silly, finding the humor. There's a number of very famous storytellers from the Jewish tradition, and many of their stories are just based up in humor. And who's suffered? We all suffer, right? But who suffered more than the Jewish faith over millennia? But they find the humor in that. So I feel
Mm.
like that wisdom of, okay, yeah, this is miserable, and people are dying, and that's horrible. And where is the humor? Where is the levity? How can we get through each day, each moment?
Mm.
Um,
But I
yeah.
wonder
So
for
I
your
don't.
son, like, is it helpful for him to hear that, like, because I actually see that with the clients that I work with, where they're either going to I don't want to go there, or I'm going there and I've gone to the worst case scenario. And so in the case of your son, how do you see that helps him to go to like everyone's dead, the world is decimated, you're gone? How do you think that? And because one of the things that you mentioned is about compassion and empathy and how stories have the ability to do that. How does that? I don't know. How do you see that's helpful for him? And I understand. I think the levity part is where most of us go. Like, let's just watch a bunch of funny movies during this hard time as a way to kind of balance. But I think the one that's it's harder for most people to go to from I've seen from other my clients is to go down to like the meltdown scenario. So why is that? How is that important, do you think?
That's interesting. So, in some ways, part of being a storyteller is to listen. So, when my daughter pulls out the Dr. Seuss book, instead of saying, "That's when you were 5 years old, let's read something else," I listen and say, "She needs this book for some reason." So,
Mm,
when my son says, "I want the Everybody Dies story," part of me is like, "No, I don't want to tell that story.
right.
You want that story." And I feel like we are alive reading the story. And I think that there's something like, he, I don't know. I should ask him actually, but maybe it's like, well, here's a story where it's even worse. Everything is even worse.
It can't get worse from here.
Yeah, right, exactly. Here's the absolute bottom. My wife and I are more inclined to watch funny YouTube videos or things to escape. It's interesting. I'm short answer is I don't know. I really am, and just very personally listening to my kids.
Yeah.
And but then we talk about it. But then because I know that book so well, I also choose the story where the two brothers have a calamity and they go into the forest. They're all alone and they come out of it okay at the end and they
Okay,
defeat the
got
dragon.
you. With a little moral lesson, you're like, oh, let's read this one. I don't know why. I just.
Exactly. Just came out of the blue. Yeah. Yeah.
I love it. Okay, we've been talking to Antonio Sacre, and he is an award-winning storyteller as well as he just wrote. He's written a book called My Name Is Cool, as well as World's Second Best Dad, which is a new album that's out. So thank you so much for being here. And I want to continue in our next segment talking about some of the traditions, kind of your talks with your aunties and and finding out and your dad and finding out a little bit about the your culture and how that's playing into the stories that you tell. So thanks for being here.
My pleasure. It's great to be here with you.
It means so much to me that you're listening to the show. Would love your support in any way by giving me comments below or to subscribe to the show or share the show with friends. Thank you again for your support. Love and blessings.